Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for coming here and thank you very much for hosting me here. Today we'll talk about some of the important aspects which the contemporary world needs to know, and some of the other areas in which the Quran has been interpreted, and it has been given this, I would say, this signature or this sign in which we see that people who read the Quran, who discuss the Quran, they draw inspiration from the Quran. At the same time, if I may quote, this is about a century ago when a four-time British Prime Minister, he is supposed to have said this in the British Parliament, that as long as there is this Quran, there cannot be any world peace. And he was actually referring to some of the Quranic verses which talk about chopping off the heads of the idolaters, or killing the disbelievers, or not making friends with non-Muslims, showing this aggression against non-Muslims. And then as you see that the punishment of apostasy, in which it is recommended that you chop off or kill a person who leaves Islam. So some of the concerns which have arisen according to this contemporary understanding of Islam have been addressed, and today I'm going to talk about some of these areas which relate to this particular area, in which some of the verses of the Quran, some of the background of the Quran, that has been neglected, and in particular the context, I would say, has been neglected. And as a result, we find that the verses in the Quran which talk about this harshness from God, which talk about a lot of aggression from God, it seems as if God is always angry in the Quran. And when you hand over the Quran to a beginner, I would say, or a person who is a non-Muslim, it's difficult for him to make sense of many verses. Of course, non-Muslims do connect with the Quran and they find their own prophets being discussed. Especially Christians, we find when Jesus is being discussed in such a illustrious way, it gives them a certain boost. But at the same time, they don't or fail to understand that how can these Muslims living in non-Muslim countries and being given this agenda, so to speak, by the Quran to destroy places of worship or not live in harmony with non-Muslims, and at the same time profess to that oath of allegiance in which they say that yes, as citizens of the US or UK or Australia or any Commonwealth country, we are your loyal subjects. So this is an area in which we will talk about, and before actually approaching this subject, I would like to say a certain thing which is generally, I would say, not said in so many words, and it's quite disappointing actually, because when I was teaching the Quran many years ago to some of my students, so one of my students came up to me and he said that, well, it's out of my own reverence for the Quran that you've asked us to read the Quran, so we do read the Quran, but to be honest, I find the Quran to be a pretty boring document, because it talks about previous nations, it talks about so many things, it does not relate to me, it has a lot of history into it, it has a lot of anger from God, and I have to pick and choose from the Quran exactly where I find my own guidance from the Quran. So this is an area that I'm going to address, and the second area that I'm going to address after that would be that we have to understand the genre of the Quran, or the category to which the Quran belongs, some of the aspects of its theme, which make it a book which might be beyond us in certain respects, but at the same time very, very approachable. And finally, the format and structure of the Quran, so that we can have efficient reading of the Quran, and if we are able to understand the Quran in a way that we make sense of certain localized verses, some verses which might seem to have a very, very specific context, and of course verses which have that universal guidance, or the aspect of universal guidance in them. But the first thing that I think the point that I'd like to make here is that the Quran, when it starts off speaking to you, it presupposes a very important fact which we Muslims tend to neglect, and that is that we have been blessed with common sense and intellect, and a greater part of religion that we think is religion is already ingrained in our own selves. So you see, the Quran actually complements this religion that we already have in our own intuition, in our own fitrah, as the Quran says. So it builds upon this, and therefore it does not give original guidance on many areas. For example, it would not tell you that, or normally it would not be the first one to tell you that honesty or truth or justice, these are things to be cherished, because this is something that we have already born with. So a greater part of God's guidance is inbuilt in us. And as members of this human fraternity, as members of humankind, we are born with this collective heritage in which we are blessed with this divine guidance in the form of good and evil, in the form of awareness that we are born and we have been created, and in the form of this notion that we would be held questionable for some of the blessings that we have been given by God. So you see, what the Quran presupposes is that all this guidance is already ingrained in you. It does not bring new guidance to you in these aspects. And so one of the ways in which people get disappointed when they read the Quran is that the preconceived notion they might have about the Quran regarding many areas, they tend to, miss it just because they perhaps overlook this fact that as far as guidance is concerned, the Quran is not the first book of guidance. The first scripture of guidance, if I can use this word, is basically your own innate guidance, which you have with you in the form of common sense, in the form of intellect, and in the form of intuition. And the Quran actually builds upon that. And this is something which is a common human heritage. It's not something specific to Muslims, not something specific to believers. It is a human heritage. So when you read the Quran, you have to make this concession to it, that it would not bring up certain subjects simply because those subjects are already found or already discussed by our own nature. And the second thing is that wherever it does bring up these subjects, it is not to provide original guidance. It's basically to remind us, to tell us that, well, you have this truth and you have this honesty, you have all good values ingrained in you, and you are forgetting these good values. So when the Quran talks about basic human values, it's not that it's informing us for the first time that these are basic human values. It presupposes that we already have these values in our own being, and it only needs to remind us of these things. So the Quran acts as a reminder. So therefore we see that the Quran calls itself a reminder. In Arabic, the word is zikra or tazkir, which actually means something which reminds you of something. So if we are able to understand this, that a major part of guidance is something which God has given us in our own selves by birth, and the Quran is going to supplement that guidance. We would, perhaps gauge the Quran in a way in which we would not be finding everything from the Quran. We would not be having recourse to the Quran for every single thing, because the scheme of the Almighty is that it's not going to tell you every single thing. We are not born blind. We have been born with this perfect guidance, and as a result of that guidance that we have, the curiosity that we have, we see science and technology taking huge leaps because of, again, that the first guidance that we had, and at the same time, morals being discussed in a way in our own selves, that we have the conscience in us which tells us about right and wrong. It tells us whether we should follow this right and wrong, and if we don't, we have this conscience pricking us. So the first thing which is important to realize about the Quran is that it builds upon that human guidance that we already have. And if we miss out on this fact, we would actually be looking for this guidance that we already have inside of us, outside of us in the Quran. And the Quran, although discusses that guidance also, but it is in a very passing way, in a way that it would be reminding us of that guidance, not in an original way. And if we don't keep track of this, as one of my students said, we have this sort of disappointment that perhaps the Quran is not addressing every single thing that I might be having in my mind. The second important area in which we need to view the Quran is the light, or is the thing that I mentioned earlier on, is what exactly is the genre of the Quran, or what is the category of the Quran? Is it a book of guidance, so to speak, in the form of proverbs? Is it a book of history? Is it a book of prose? Is it a book of poetry? How exactly should we place the Quran? And I can tell you out of my own experience that this is such an important area that if we miss out on this particular area, we, again, as I said, would approach the Quran with a preconceived notion, and then not finding what we might have imagined. We might end up saying that, well, okay, fine, the Quran has a lot of things, but I don't find it addressing some of the things that I would like it to have addressed. So the second area that is very important here to note is that as far as the Quran is concerned, the best possible, I would say, analogy that comes to mind when you describe the Quran is that it is a book of dialogue. It's a book of dialogue between 7th century real characters which were there on the Arabian stage, if I borrow the word stage, because it's a book of dialogue. And the closest genre that comes to mind, human mind, is, I'm not comparing the Quran, of course, but just to give you an idea, the way you can see a drama being laid out, a drama being enacted in which there are people who talk to you, people who are there, and as characters they converse with one another. And this conversation actually is between real individuals, and these individuals, of course, they include the Prophet himself, they include the non-believers, which are, of course, the Christians and the Jews and the idolaters. Even Satan speaks in the Quran. We find angels speaking in the Quran. We find, of course, all this dialogue being narrated by God himself. So basically, it's a book of I would say, dialogues embedded in narration from the Almighty himself. And one of the reasons that you would find the Quran at times showing this abruptness and incoherence is because at times you don't realize that this dialogue is taking place between different entities. And if I'm talking to someone and I'm just shifting to another addressee, so that shift, if I don't account for in my own mind, it's taking place because the content has changed with respect to the speaker. And if I'm able to identify the change of the speaker, I'll be able to identify why that change of content had occurred. Otherwise, I would have just thought, well, the Quran was discussing something, and immediately after a particular topic, something very different has come up, which has no relationship with the previous topic. So one of the reasons for that is that the discussion of the Quran is in a way that the people who are speaking or the spoken to, they rapidly change. The Quran speaks in a way that all these characters which I just mentioned to you, they talk to each other, they keep on talking to each other, and at times, as I said, the speaker would be speaking to 2 or 3 or 4 individuals or groups placed right in front of them. So it's like a divine sermonizer talking to 2 or 3 or 4 individuals or groups at the same time. And as it shifts its dialogue to other people, if we don't account for the speaker or the spoken to which has changed, we would perhaps have that notion which very commonly is found in many Western scholars, that the Quran is an incoherent book. It seems that topics are discussed in a way that they bear no relation. So just to be a little more, I would say, illustrative to this, what I just said. So you see, if you understand the dynamics of a dialogue, let me just borrow a dialogue from, let's say, the famous literati, Shakespeare. And in one of his plays, which is called Julius Caesar, there are characters who speak to each other. For example, we have Brutus, we have Caesar himself, and if you study any book of dialogues, you'll find that the characters are arranged in a way that the person who is speaking is always mentioned on the left, and we have a colon right in front of that, and whatever is spoken is then and it starts with, for example, Act 1, Scene 1, which would mean that this is the first thing which is being portrayed. And exactly in a very similar manner, you'll find that the Quran opens in a way that all these characters which I just spoke about, they discuss things, and the only difference is that, for example, in this particular example that I gave you regarding Shakespeare, if I just delete the names of the speaker and the spoken to, what will happen is that out of my own intellect, I need to decipher that who is speaking and to whom it is being spoken to. So the Quran is exactly arranged in a way that it is a book of dialogues between real life people and people who exist in 7th century Arabia, God speaking to people, God being talked to. When we pray or we do dua, of course, we're talking to God. But the difference between, for example, a human work like Julius Caesar is that the person who is speaking, and of course the people who are spoken to, they are always mentioned. I mean, you'll know who is speaking and you know who is being spoken to, because the author himself makes this distinction, and therefore it becomes easy to you. But in the Quran, what happens is, if you pick up a surah, any particular surah, you'll find that yes, there are people who are speaking, but of course, if you are not, the author himself has not chosen the same format as we have, and he lets us decide through our own understanding. On most occasions, we don't falter. On most occasions, we are able to understand that whatever the Quran is, and whatever the person is speaking, and whoever is being spoken to is clearly evident. But there are areas in which this is not very evident. And for that, we need to be more careful, we need to be more attentive. And as we go along in the Quran, for example, a particular surah, as these acts and scenes change, you come to a next part. And for example, there was a group speaking to be spoken here, God speaking to the hypocrites, God speaking to the people of the book, God speaking to the idolaters, and then, of course, the scene changes, and you see the same, the content being delivered in a different way, in which now Muslims, or maybe believers is the right word, they will be talking to one another, they will be talking to the Prophet, they will be conversing with one another, they will be asking questions. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is something which for the first time was presented and pointed out by a very famous scholar of the Quran. His name was Ustaz Hamid, and he is the teacher of Amin Asad Islahi. You must be knowing his name. And he said that, well, one of the reasons that we are not able to gauge what the Quran is about and the nature of the Quran is that we have not paid enough attention to the genre of the Quran or the category of the Quran. And he says that we have to realize that it's a book of dialogues embedded in narration. So it's like speaking to people who are living there. Now, this gives a very, very different outlook to a number of things, and it also answers certain questions. For example, Buddhism existed contemporary to Islam, and in fact, it pre-existed. We know that. But we find absolutely no mention of Buddhism in the Quran. Hinduism is another example. So it does seem mind-boggling that a book revealed in an era in which there were two other religions, very, very powerful. Of course, Christianity and Judaism were there in Arabia, but they are not even touched upon. You're not going to find Buddha or Hinduism in any way being discussed with them. So, and this is a question which many people ask. So the answer to that question, according to the Farahian approach, would be, well, the answer is very simple. Because the Quran is a dialogue between people living in Arabia at that time. You don't find a Hindu there, you don't find for example, a Buddhist there. So therefore, if they are not discussed, the simple reason for that is that lack of discussion or non-discussion is pointing to the fact that people who are actually in Arabia, they are being spoken to. So therefore, a lot of things in the Quran which do not relate to Arabia is not even discussed there. A very famous example you might be knowing is the mention of Uzair being the son of the Jews of Arabia regarded Uzair to be the son of God, just as the Christians regarded Jesus to be the son of God. But this is the belief of just the Jews of Arabia. You will not find this to be a belief of the Jews outside of Arabia. For example, in the Roman Empire, which existed at that time. So therefore, when Jews find that the Quran says that Uzair is the son of God and is mentioned in the Quran, they'll say, well, this is a lie. It's not possible. We never regard it so. So the Quran is actually speaking about the Jews of Arabia only, because, as I said, it is set in a very, very specific context in which it is speaking to the Arabs of those times, and those Arabs are basically telling you, the Quran is conversing about the concepts which the Arabs themselves were very, very familiar about. And if Uzair is being called the son of God in the Quran, it is basically because of the fact that it relates to the Jews of Arabia only. It's not relating to to non-Arabian Jews. And for that matter, if it is not discussing Hinduism or Buddhism or other things or areas in which the Arabs were not familiar with or were not found in Arabia, you'll find they are not going to be mentioned here. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there is this localized aspect of the Quran. It doesn't mean that it loses universal guidance. For that, I'm going to just talk about in a while. But the important thing is we have to realize, and the points that we have made so far are basically two. First, that the Quran builds upon the guidance which human beings have already been given in the form of intellect, in the form of common sense, in the form of curiosity. And every single human being is equipped with that, and the Quran is going to build upon that. And the second thing is that it's a book of dialogues, and those dialogues were taking place between people, living people of the time of Arabia, Prophet Muhammad, and this gives it a specific outlook. And in the presence of this specific outlook, there is also a very, very major universal part, which as a result we can derive. But before we can do that, we need to understand that when we approach the Quran with this, and that is that if the Quran is a book of dialogues, then of course there has to be a certain specific nature to that dialogue. For example, when I'm speaking to you, we are having a conversation. So there are going to be certain things which are going to be specific to this atmosphere, this environment that we are speaking to, or we are finding ourselves in. And then there are going to be certain things that can be drawn from our conversation as a result or as a consequence of the conversation that that took place between us. So the Quran is in its dialogue nature, as I said, has a very, very specific connotation. And remember, I just started off my talk by saying that a lot of verses in the Quran which talk about God's anger, which talk about chopping off the heads of non-believers, which talk about, for example, punishing them in a very severe way. And when we take this cue from the Quran, we find people like Mullah Umar or Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, even today, finding these verses there. They think that there is some guidance which is present in this Quran that we need to, follow the example of the Prophet. So if the Prophet was directed to do these things which are mentioned, so as a consequence, we as believers or followers of the Prophet, we have been enjoined in the same way. So the Quran is in its dialogue nature, as I said, has a very, very specific connotation. And remember, I just started off my talk by saying that a lot of verses in the Quran which talk about God's anger, which talk about chopping off the heads of non-believers, which talk about, for example, punishing them in a very severe way. And when we take this cue from the Quran, we find people like Mullah Umar or Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr Baghdadi, even today, finding these verses there. They think that there is some guidance which is present in this Quran that we need to, follow the example of the Prophet. So if the Prophet was directed to do these things which are mentioned, so as a consequence, we as believers or followers of the Prophet, we have been enjoined in the same way. So now in my next segment, which I'm going to just discuss and give you a chance to raise questions as well in the meantime, would be that how come we know that there are certain specific directives and there are certain universal directives, and these specific directives which are actually related to a particular milieu, they have been governed by a specific law which is found in the Quran, and that law is related to the messengers of God which were sent generally to Palestine and to Central Arabia, that area, and of course lastly to our own Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.